Welcome. You're listening to The Aligned Self, Conversations in Creating a Conscious and Abundant Life. This is Daniel Denovi. I'll be your guide and host. Let's see just where we can take this. Hello, friend, and welcome back to the continuing conversation where I share 50 years of wisdom, ideas and concepts and spiritual truths that I've come upon over my 60 plus years on the planet. I ended up talking a little bit over an hour, and this is part 2 of a 3-part. So if you haven't yet listened to part 1, I suggest you go back to the previous episode and listen to part 1 so there will be continuity in this conversation for you. So in this episode, we pick up right after I explain the how to, want to, chance to, the motive, means, and opportunity, the 3 things you need to accomplish or achieve anything. And as we begin right at the tail end of that conversation, we'll carry on. So without further delay, here we are. But if you have the know-how, if you have the opportunity, but you don't have the desire, nothing will happen. The good news is that if you have an inkling, and maybe you don't have a real strong desire, you can feed the fire. You can think about it. You can visit. I used to visit the Rolls-Royce dealer and sit in the Rolls-Royce. The salesperson did not really like it because I was in my 20s. He knew, obviously, I wasn't going to buy a Rolls-Royce. But I thought I really wanted it. And once I sat in the Rolls-Royce, I didn't really like it. That was a key piece of information. But had I sat in it and I realized I did like it, I would have another component to add to my internal representation of what having that Rolls-Royce really was like. That would add to my desire. The entrepreneur and businessman Dan Pena has a quote that says, "Smell the leather." And that's literally about going to the Rolls-Royce dealer and smelling the leather. Immerse yourself in the experience. When I was in my 20s and 30s, and even today, I used to drive around really nice neighborhoods. I would take pictures of mansions. I would go to the Parade of Homes. I would tour houses. Today, you can tour houses on YouTube. My wife and I do this all the time. We look at places all across the country, estates and ranches and areas with property, because we're not going to stay where we are. We're going to something bigger. I want to create a retreat, an area where people come to me. I was told that when I was younger. It's always resonated with me. And now is the time. So within the next 3 years, I'll have that in place. My wallpaper on my computer is a $14 million property. 245 acres. It's right here in Texas. It's beautiful, Tuscany style. And at the moment, it's a little outside my budget, but it may not be for very long. But every time I fire up my computer, I see that. And the way I said it, I invoke the miraculous. This is another thing that I've learned over the years. I invoke the miraculous. If you only, attract based on your current level of knowing, you may leave a lot on the table. You could have something even more amazing, more magnificent. And so how I invoke the miraculous is that which you don't necessarily expect. And so you plan to the best of your ability, and you say something like this: XYZ is my intention, and I plan to the best of my ability, and I'm in action to make that happen. But I am completely open to something more amazing, more fantastic, more phenomenal to show up. This or something better. One of my friends, Tom T. Moore, is a channel. He has adopted, in fact, he's written several books, something he's received through his channeling efforts. He channels aliens, and he has a wild relationship with the fifth dimension. But one of the things that he espouses is an MBO, and that is the most benevolent outcome. You see, earlier I was talking about intentions that are aligned with your ego. And one of the ways we get around that is by invoking the most benevolent outcome for all concerned. We've all heard about the butterfly effect. And let me say, the butterfly effect is the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in California can create a cascade event, one ripple at a time, that results in a hurricane in Florida. There's even a movie called The Butterfly Effect. It's about going back in time and changing one little aspect here, one little event there, in order to have a more favorable outcome. There's something that someone is present to, let's say today, and you think, if I could only go back and change that one thing, maybe change something about your parents, change, the outcome of a test, or a relationship that you let go, astray. But the problem is from our limited point of view where we currently are, we can't see the resulting consequence of the long-term consequence that more than likely creates a bigger problem than we're currently aware of. Hence the butterfly effect. You go back and change one little thing there. It's just this little dinky-do thing, but it can change an entire course of events in your life and other people's lives. So with Tom T. Moore's MBO, that's how we get around that. We turn it over to God, Goddess, all that is. We turn it over to Source. And we just usher in, it's kind of like, invoking the miraculous, but we invoke the most benevolent outcome for all concerned. We don't want to wish other people harm because that's not nice. And from law of attraction, if we're invested in the energy of doing other people harm, of wanting them to lose, of wanting them to get sick or whatever, or kind of laughing at their misfortune, then we are aligning with that vibrational state, aligning with that energy, and we attract those or similar circumstances to our life. And so when we're vested in everybody winning, the most benevolent outcome for all concerned, if we don't immediately get what we want, what we intend, we will eventually. Now, with that said, I've also learned along the way that karma is not a thing. You can opt out of the whole belief of karma. The idea of what goes around comes around. If you do bad things, sooner or later you will reap the benefits or the negative consequences. Now, karma is a default program, meaning that if you have your hands off the wheel, if you're not consciously engaged in your life, then you will experience karma because it's a way the universe teaches you lessons, teaches you how to rise above certain circumstances. But if you decide to consciously learn, to learn from your mistakes, to learn from your trespasses, how you hurt other people, knowingly or unknowingly, when you can learn from your mistakes and learn from other people's mistakes, you can rise above karma. You don't have to engage in it. You can actually divorce yourself from the process. But it does require conscious engagement in your own learning, in your own evolution. One of the things that takes the place of karma is knowing or realizing how law of attraction works. And that essentially says like energy attracts like energy. Law of attraction is always working. A lot of people say, I can't get law of attraction working. That's only because they're not getting what they think they want, but you are getting what you're aligned with vibrationally. And so all you have to do is take a look at what's showing up in your life. And if you don't like it, change your vibration, change your focus, change how you're attuned. Now, earlier I said, there's no such thing as obstacles. And I don't know if I completely explained that. When I learned how to firewalk and I began teaching firewalking, I realized that the coals in between where I was and where I wanted to go seemed like an obstacle. But it was only an obstacle when I focused on it as being in the way. What I've learned is that the coals are just something to handle. If you're in a room with a window and a door, and the door shut and the window shut, those are obstacles to getting out of the room. But we've handled enough doors and we've handled enough windows that more than likely you can get out one or the other. And so they are just something to handle. One time I was driving down the highway and there was a truck in front of me, a long flatbed, a lorry, a semi. And this big bale of hay blew off the back and landed in the road. It was a hazard. It was an obstacle. I simply drove around it. Then I pulled over to the side and I walked back and I pulled that bale of hay off the road when I had an opportunity, so it was not going to hinder anybody else that wasn't prepared to handle it. And that's all I have to say about obstacles. Now, something that you'll have to endure or deal with on your adventure of being human, and that is disappointment. Chances are, at some point or another, you will not have your expectations fulfilled. You will be disappointed. You may lose a relationship. Somebody may die that you love. You may lose a job. You may not get the gold ring. Your business may fail. I've had 5 failed businesses. I've had my heart broken. And I say that because I had the expectation that it would continue, and they didn't feel the same way. That has happened on more than one occasion. But I was 19 or 20 when it happened the first time, and I have to tell you, I was devastated. I didn't think I was ever going to live again. I made myself quite miserable for a good 3 months. Well, one night I met some friends at the local discotheque, the dancing bar. It was called The Light, in the city that I grew up in. And they had a dance floor similar to Saturday Night Fever that was all lit up. But one of the songs that played was The Beat Goes On by The Whispers. And in listening to it, I had a moment of enlightenment. And in the song, it says, the rivers still flow, the birds still sing, the beat goes on. And I realized in hearing that the last 3 months I had been miserable. I made myself miserable. Yet the world didn't care. The birds didn't care. The animals didn't care. The rivers still flowed. It still rained. The sun still came up. The world moved on. It was just my own personal hell that I had created, because I was living in the idea that things should have been some other way than the way they were. But then I was faced with the truth. The facts of the matter is that we were not in a relationship, or I was not in a relationship with the girl, the woman that I wanted to be in a relationship with, or thought I wanted to be in a relationship with. But I could have been, I should have been, but I wasn't. So that is a vicious circle right there. You can't get out of it. That is the definition of suffering, is thinking that things could be some other way than the way they are. There's a lack of acceptance. And this lesson of accepting what is probably the biggest spiritual lesson that a person could take on. Accepting what's so, accepting the facts of the matter. It was also at that moment that I actually got the aphorism, don't cry over spilt milk. I mean, it's over. It's done. The only thing you can do is wipe it up, pour yourself another glass. But how often does people spill the milk and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. If only I'd put the glass further back on the table. Or somebody else might say, if you were more coordinated, if you were more careful, you wouldn't have spilled it. Or it shows you have no respect for milk. Well, you spill the milk, you wipe it up, you clean it up, you pour yourself another glass. Or maybe you decide to drink lemonade. Now, kids seem to get this whole concept that you couldn't do anything other than the way you did it. I used to walk. I used to be a walker when I was in elementary school. It was about half a mile away, 3/4 of a mile. And my mother was, I was the oldest of 4 boys at the time. And my mother expected me home by a certain time. Well, inevitably, on the way home, I would be distracted by other things going on, girls, or I'd play with friends, or I'd stop by the store, or I'd stop at the church. My uncle was a Presbyterian minister. I would visit the church. I'd visit him, or I just found things to do between here and there more often than not. And then my mother would ask me, why weren't you home by 3 o'clock? And I started listing off all the reasons why I wasn't home on time. And she would say, well, you should have been home at 3 o'clock. And I'm like, no, I couldn't have been, because I stopped to talk to Ruthie. I stopped and played with Rod. I visited with my Uncle Don for a little time in the church. I couldn't have been home at 3 o'clock. It just wouldn't have worked. But I should have been. There was no way I could have been. But if my mother would have said, tomorrow, I want you to come straight home, and I want you home by 3 o'clock, then you could go out and play. That would have made sense to me. So I often say when things don't work, I'll set it up. Next time, I'll know what to do. And this is also a way that I've built confidence in my ability to respond more effectively in the future. If something doesn't turn out the way I wanted it to, maybe I didn't have the conversation, didn't say the right words, just didn't work out the way I wanted it to, I would play it out the way I wanted it to in my mind, pretending next time when I do this, this is what I would say, this is how I would show up, this is how I would carry myself. And this brings me to another spiritual lesson that I've learned along the way, is that life is an opportunity to learn. You can learn from your mistakes, and you can learn from other people's mistakes, and you can even forecast what could go wrong and devise a plan around it. Now, most people look ahead and they see what could go wrong, and they say, oh, that's fearful. I don't know if I can do that. But if you play out the worst-case scenario and devise a plan to what you will do or how you will handle it if it shows up, then you're prepared. Then you can move ahead with courage and confidence. Now, going back to that moment when I was on the dance floor and I heard this song, The Beat Goes On, the other realization I had at that moment is that we live our whole life in our head. Here I was in suffering for 3 months. Everybody else was going on like business as usual. Life was normal. There's nothing wrong. In my mind, though, it was the end of the world. I was suffering. But I was suffering because of how I was looking at the situation, what I made that event mean. I chose the meaning. I was exercising my ability my freedom to choose my response. And the response that I was choosing at the time was not very elegant. Now, this lesson was compounded about 8 years later when I became certified as an NLP practitioner. One of the first presuppositions of NLP is that the map is not the territory, and the map is all we have access to. You see, as a human being, we take the world outside of us and we represent it through our 5 representational systems: visually, auditorily, kinesthetically, sensation, olfactory, and taste. We package it in our 5 senses. We interpret the world vibrationally. We reinterpret, we recapitulate the world, and we truncate, delete, and generalize information so all the information out there fits in our itty-bitty head. Well, in the process, we make some errors in our representing. We have symbolic representations of the world out there. We don't actually interact with the real world. It's always some kind of representation, a perception of what's going on. And this is why you'll probably hear the spiritual accolades from different spiritual teachers and that the world is an illusion. Well, it's because you create the illusion. You create a facsimile of the world, a representation of the world. And so that's why I have sought to be disillusioned about the world. I want to be disillusioned. I want to find out where my assumptions and perceptions are not accurate, or they don't play out over time. They're not universal in nature, meaning that they don't work from context to context, or in other words, situation to situation. Because in my mind, if something is true, if it stands the test of time, it will work in a multitude of situations. Now, nothing works across the board all the time. And this probably brings me to the next lesson that I picked up along the way as a result of NLP training, and that is requisite variety. The idea that the person or the organism with the most flexibility to respond to changing situations is the one that will rule the system, or in other words, survive. So when you can create more options for yourself, then you actually give yourself greater flexibility to respond to life. Abraham Maslow said that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you'll begin to treat everything as if it's a nail. But if you have a diverse toolbox, you can adapt to just about any situation and prevail. Now, another lesson that I've learned that has, I guess, alleviated a lot of emotional angst is that other people do not have my brain. There's no 2 people on the planet that have your brain or an exact brain. You can think about anybody else in your life and think about trading brains with them right now. Immediately you realize, well, you don't have their references, their history, their experiences. You don't see the world exactly the same. Even two people that are in relationship, they say, I love you too. They're not talking about exactly the same thing. It's impossible. Yet most of us walk around and interact with other people as if they had our brain, as if they understood exactly what we wanted, exactly what we were trying to say. That we don't have to change our message, we don't have to change our approach, they just get it. If they don't get it, they're screwed up. It's their problem. Well, the truth is that there's over 1 billion people on the planet, and each person is living their life inside their own head. Their experience, their point of view is valid for them. It works for them to some degree. And there's areas where it doesn't work. But their point of view is their point of view. No two people see the world exactly the same. When you get that, you'll have a lot more latitude in your behavior. You'll be a lot more forgiving, a lot more accepting of other people. And this also brings me to the next spiritual truth that I learned, is that the world is a mirror of your mind. Because we live our whole life in our head, because all we have access to is our representation of the world, not the real world, even our perceptions of other people, we tend to see what we want to see. We experience them the way we want to experience them. We have an expectation of how they will show up, and how can they not show up any other way? Because even if they show up some other way than we expect, in the back of our mind, we know what they're really like. They're just putting on a show. It's not their real behavior. We wait with bated breath for when they really show up the way we know they'll show up. This is how we create the people in our life. It's how we fall in love, and it's how we fall out of love. You know, when we fall in love, we associate, we replay all the positive, wonderful aspects, and some of them aren't even truth. It's what we want to see. They might lean in a direction, and we think, oh, that's it, and we blow it out of proportion. Maybe. We play it up. We associate. We draw it in close, in other words. We make it bigger than life. We add more color. And that activates our feelings of love and attraction. It actually creates desire. Then over time, we might be in a mood one day, and we start associating that mood with that person that we used to love. And we start noticing different behaviors that we don't particularly care for, or maybe weren't present when we were first dating. And over time, we start focusing more and more on the things we don't like, associating to the things we don't like, and we fall out of love with that person. Now, they're essentially the same person. We just began focusing on different things. And there's always the off chance that maybe they weren't being entirely truthful. Maybe they were trying to manipulate the situation. Maybe they were putting their best face forward. Maybe you were putting your best face forward. And over time, that's hard to do, or an extended period of time. And so we tend to let our guard down. We get a little lazy. And so we may show more of our less admirable traits. But have you ever noticed, once you make a determination about another person, on how hard it is for them to show up any other way than the way you expect them to? Or even if somebody else has an expectation about you, they won't see that you've changed. They won't see that that behavior is kind of a minor thing in your experience. It's not how you always show up, but it's what they choose to focus on. And they tend to be overly critical about that, and they can't accept you any other way than the way they can see you. And that's why we want to move to another country or another city so we can live without that expectation or that label that they've put on us. That's why people get divorced and they want to reinvent themselves and start over. One of the ways you can get around that, if you want to reinvent yourself inside a relationship, is that you tell the other person you want to make some changes. You're going to change some of your behavior, and you want them to give you some latitude in making mistakes, of not getting it right, of not necessarily following through, because it's all a work in progress. And then, my friend, it's incumbent upon you to walk your talk, to show up, to do what you say you're going to do. And that brings up another lesson that I learned early on, and I keep having to teach myself of it, because these old patterns of people-pleasing and wanting to be accepted are there. It's an old story that comes up from time to time. And sometimes I overpromise and underdeliver because I want to make the big promise. I want to show up, but I'm not necessarily moving heaven and earth to fulfill on that promise. And that's my bad. That's a lack of integrity. See, integrity is actually doing what you said you would do in the way that you said you would do it. It's being your word. Your word is your bond. Most people are not operating in integrity. It is an ideal. It is a goal. The more we can operate our life with or in alignment with our word, the more constant and consistent and credible we'll be. And so if you've had a habit of not following through on your word and the other person sees it, knows it, that you don't have integrity, start making small promises to yourself and only promises that you know you will keep. Only make promises to them that you know you will keep. So integrity is big. The more you can align and show up as your word, you can literally recreate your life because you simply make a new declaration. This is how I'm showing up, and you align your behavior with it, and that becomes law because your actions or how you're being is aligned with your intention. All right, this is the end of part 2. We're going to move on to part 3 where I complete my 50 years of wisdom that I'm sharing. These are the lessons, the ideas, the concepts that have made a big difference in my life and in the difference in the lives of my clients. So until next time, this is your friend and host, Daniel Denovi, urging you to follow your bliss. Live your life from inner signals. Be inner directed as you engage in the epic adventure.